A single drop of fill blood falls from my glaive, pooling on the obsidian floor of my cell. 10,000 years I have contemplated this path, the choice that stripped away my mortality, my sight, my very soul. They called us the Illidari, demon hunters, we who sacrificed everything in service to a master the world branded betrayer. I remember the day I answered his call, young and certain that any price was worth paying to save our world. Now, in the silence between wars, I understand the true weight of what we surrendered. This is the story of those who gave up their humanity so that others might keep theirs. I was nothing before I became everything. A scout in the Silver Moon Ranges, my greatest concern the accuracy of my aim and the sharpness of my blade. The world seemed vast then, full of mysteries to explore and enemies to face with righteous certainty. How small my understanding was, how precious that ignorance. The call came on the wind first, carried by whispers among the troops. Illidan Stormrage, the betrayer himself, sought volunteers for a mission beyond imagining. Not soldiers, the rumors said. Something else entirely. Something that would require a sacrifice no sane person would make willingly. I remember dismissing it at first. Tales of the infamous twin brother had reached even our remote outposts. The one who had consumed the skull of Gul'dan, who had transformed himself into something between elf and demon. A cautionary tale surely, the kind of story told to remind us why the path of righteousness mattered. But then came the reports from the front lines. Entire platoons annihilated by forces that moved like shadows, struck like lightning, and vanished before retaliation could find them. The Legion was not fighting as they had before. They were learning, adapting, growing stronger with each victory. Captain Thalorian gathered us that evening beside the smoldering remains of what had been Fairbreeze Village. The acrid smoke mixed with the scent of charred flesh and something else. Something that made the air itself taste of corruption and despair. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Civilians who had never held a weapon in anger reduced to ash and bone by fell fire. "Look upon this," he said, his voice carrying a weight I had never heard before. "Look and understand that our current methods are insufficient. The enemy adapts faster than we can respond. They know our tactics, our weaknesses, our limitations." Among the ruins, a child's toy caught my eye. A wooden dragon, painted in bright blues and golds, now scorched and broken. Its painted eyes seemed to stare accusingly at us, asking why we had failed to protect what mattered most. "There is another way," Thalorian continued, "a path that promises power enough to match their corruption with our own controlled darkness. Illidan Stormrage calls for volunteers, those willing to sacrifice everything." The pause before those final words stretched like a chasm. We all understood that sacrifice in war was expected. Life, comfort, safety, these were prices soldiers paid willingly. But the way he spoke suggested something far more fundamental, something that touched the very essence of what we were. That night, I could not sleep. The image of the dragon haunted me, along with the faces of the children I had failed to save, not through cowardice or incompetence, but through simple inadequacy. We were bringing swords to fight forces that commanded the very fabric of reality itself. In the pre-dawn darkness, I made my decision, not from nobility or heroism, but from a cold recognition of necessity. If the enemy could not be defeated by conventional means, then unconventional methods must be considered, even if the cost was everything I held dear. The journey to Shadowmoon Valley took 3 days. Others had made the same choice. I could see them on the roads, traveling alone or in small groups, warriors from every alliance race and some from the Horde. We did not speak to each other during the journey. What was there to say? We were all walking toward the same unknown, carrying the same desperate hope that meaning could be found in sacrifice. The Black Temple rose from the broken landscape like a malignant growth, its twisted spires reaching toward a sky stained perpetual crimson. Even at a distance, I could feel something emanating from its walls. Not malice exactly, but a kind of purposeful intensity that made my bones ache and my vision blur at the edges. Guards met us at the outer gates. Not the fell orcs I had expected, but night elves bearing glaives that hummed with barely contained energy. Their eyes were gone, replaced by points of sickly green light that seemed to see far more than normal sight ever could. They moved with fluid grace, but there was something fundamentally wrong about their posture, their balance, as if they were listening to sounds the rest of us could not hear. "So," one of them said, his voice carrying an odd harmonic undertone, "more have come to test their resolve. Tell me, children of the light, do you truly understand what you seek?" A blood elf woman beside me stepped forward. I recognized her from the journey. She had carried herself with the bearing of nobility, though her clothes suggested recent hardship. "We seek the power to defend our people against the Legion's darkness." The demon hunter's lipless mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "Power, yes, that you may find. But the question is not what you seek to gain, but what you are prepared to lose." He gestured toward the temple's entrance, where more of his kind waited. "Beyond these walls lies a path from which there is no return. You will be stripped of everything that defines you as mortal beings. Your sight will be torn away and replaced with something that shows truth in all its terrible beauty. Your souls will be bound to the very demons you seek to destroy. Your bodies will be transformed into weapons against the darkness, but you will find the line between light and shadow grows thin indeed." Another recruit, a human warrior whose armor bore the marks of countless battles, spoke up. "And if we refuse, if we turn back now, then you return to your homes and your lives, and you watch as the Legion devours everything you love. Your children will burn in fell fire, and your world will become another notch on Sargeras's tally of conquered realms. You will die knowing you could have made a difference and chose comfort over necessity." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Around me, I could see the other volunteers struggling with the same realization that had driven me here. We were not choosing between good and evil. We were choosing between different kinds of loss. "I have seen what happens to those who answer this call," the demon hunter continued. "Most do not survive the transformation. Of those who do, many lose themselves to the demon within and must be put down like rabid animals. A precious few emerge with their will intact, bound forever to a purpose that will know no rest, no peace, no end." He paused, scanning our group with that unnatural sight. "Knowing this, who among you still wishes to proceed?" I expected mass defection. It would have been the rational response. Instead, I watched as nearly every volunteer stepped forward. The blood elf noblewoman, the scarred human warrior, a Draenei paladin whose faith should have forbidden such contamination, a night elf hunter whose connection to nature made the choice even more profound, and myself. My feet moved without conscious decision, carrying me toward a fate I could not fully comprehend. "Very well," the demon hunter said. "Follow me. Your old lives end at this threshold." As we passed through the gates of the Black Temple, I caught a glimpse of movement high above. A figure stood upon one of the highest balconies, wings spread against the crimson sky. Even at such distance, I could feel the weight of his attention, the terrible intelligence that had chosen this path before any of us. Illidan's storm rage, the betrayer, our soon-to-be master. The gates closed behind us with a sound like thunder, sealing us within walls that had witnessed transformations beyond counting. The air grew thicker, tainted with energies that made breathing a conscious effort. Ahead lay corridors that descended into darkness, toward chambers where the impossible would be made real. I touched the hilt of my sword one final time, feeling the familiar weight of steel and leather. Soon, these hands would hold weapons forged from shadow and starlight. These eyes would see realities that mortal sight could not encompass. This heart would beat in rhythm with demonic essence. But in that moment, I was still myself. Still the ranger who had walked the forests of Quel'Thalas, who had dreamed of glory and honor and a simple life well lived. I held that feeling close, knowing it might be the last pure memory I would ever possess. Tomorrow, the trials would begin. Tonight, I mourned the person I was about to stop being. Dawn never came to the Black Temple, only a gradual shift from deep crimson to lighter shades of corruption, as if the very sky had been stained by the acts performed beneath it. I woke on stone, my back aching from a sleep that had brought no rest. Around me, the other recruits stirred from their own fitful slumber. We had been given quarters in what might once have been a meditation hall, bare cells carved from volcanic rock, each containing nothing but a sleeping mat and a basin for washing. The water in my basin had turned green overnight. Not the clear green of forest pools, but something sick and oily that reflected my face in distorted angles. When I touched it, my fingers tingled with an energy that felt both foreign and familiar, as if recognizing something in my blood that I had not yet acknowledged. Alestra emerged from her cell looking haggard. The noble bearing that had defined her during our journey had begun to crack, revealing something raw underneath. "Did you sleep?" she asked, though the answer was obvious from the hollows beneath her eyes. "Sleep is a luxury we must learn to live without," came a voice from the corridor. Cain Sunfury stood watching us, his presence as unsettling in daylight as it had been in the crystal chamber. Dreams become dangerous when your soul begins to harbor shadows. Better to embrace wakefulness than risk losing yourself to nightmares that may not be entirely your own. He gestured for us to follow. Today, you begin to understand what you have volunteered for. Today, we introduce you to your future. The training grounds occupied a vast courtyard carved from the mountain itself. Obsidian pillars rose from the floor in seemingly random patterns, their surfaces etched with runes that hurt to look at directly. Between them, figures moved in flowing combat forms that defied conventional understanding of movement and balance. They wielded weapons I had never seen before, curved blades that seemed to bend light around their edges, glaives that hummed with barely contained energy. "Observe," Cain commanded. "See how they move, not as mortals constrained by flesh and bone, but as beings who have transcended such limitations." Two demon hunters sparred in the center of the courtyard, their battle a dance of impossible grace. They moved faster than my eyes could follow, leaving trails of green fire in the air. When they leapt, they soared distances no mortal legs could achieve. When they struck, their blades met with sounds like breaking glass and distant thunder. One of them stumbled, his form flickering for just an instant. In that moment of weakness, his opponent's blade found its mark, opening a line of green fire across his chest. The wounded hunter screamed, not in pain, but in something far more disturbing, a sound that spoke of barely contained chaos, of something inhuman trying to break free. "Control," Cain said quietly. "Always, it comes down to control. The moment you waver, the moment doubt creeps in, the demon within seizes its chance." And then, the wounded hunter's form began to shift. His limbs elongated, his skin took on a greenish hue, and when he opened his mouth, fangs gleamed in the crimson light. The transformation lasted only seconds before other demon hunters surrounded him, their combined will forcing him back to his original shape. But I had seen enough. This is what we become. The human warrior, Marcus, I learned later, asked through gritted teeth. This is what we must master, Cain corrected. The demon's power flows through us, but we are not its slaves. We are its masters, or we die trying. He led us to a rack of practice weapons. They looked deceptively simple. Curved blades with handguards designed to protect fingers during the complex spins and rotations, characteristic of demon hunter combat. But when I grasped one, the metal felt warm, almost alive, and I could swear I felt it pulse in time with my heartbeat. Your first lesson, Cain announced. Learn to move as the weapon demands, not as your mortal limitations suggest. Feel its weight, understand its balance. Let it teach you what your body can become. The next hours passed in a blur of awkward motion and mounting frustration. The glaives felt wrong in my hands, too light in some moments, impossibly heavy in others. Every time I thought I had grasped a movement, the weapon would twist in an unexpected direction, nearly taking my fingers with it. Around me, the other recruits struggled with similar difficulties. Alestra's noble training had included some weapons work, but these blades bore no resemblance to the elegant rapiers favored by Blood Elf nobility. Marcus's warrior background helped him with the strength requirements, but hindered him when it came to the fluid motions that seemed to defy martial logic. The Draenei paladin, Voros, he introduced himself, faced perhaps the greatest challenge. His entire combat philosophy revolved around steady, grounded stances and the protective power of the light. These weapons demanded constant motion, flow, an acceptance of instability that went against everything his order had taught him. You think too much, our instructor, a scarred night elf whose name I never learned, observed. You try to impose your old understanding on new realities. Release those preconceptions. Let the weapon show you its truth. By midday, several recruits had drawn blood from their own carelessness. The wounds healed faster than they should have, leaving behind faint green scars that pulsed with their own inner light. A sign, perhaps, that the corruption was already beginning. Enough, Cain called. Time for your introduction to the enemy. He led us deeper into the temple, down corridors where the air grew thick enough to taste. The walls here bore different carvings, not the historical battles depicted in the upper levels, but something more abstract. Spirals that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Geometric patterns that made my eyes water. Symbols that conveyed meaning without words, speaking directly to some primitive part of my mind that recognized them as deeply, fundamentally wrong. Every demon hunter must understand what we fight, Cain explained as we walked. Not just their tactics or their weaknesses, but their nature, their essence. To defeat an enemy, you must know it intimately, and to bind its power to your own, you must accept it completely. We descended stairs that seemed to go deeper than the mountain should have allowed. The temperature rose with each step, not the dry heat of desert sun, but something humid and oppressive that clung to skin like oil. Strange lights flickered in the distance, not the steady glow of torches or crystals, but something that writhed and danced with apparent life. The first rule of demon binding, Cain continued, is understanding that demons are not evil in the way mortals understand evil. They are alien. Their thoughts follow patterns that mortal minds cannot naturally comprehend. Their desires spring from needs we do not share. Their fears touch on realities we have never experienced. He stopped before a massive door sealed with chains that glowed with holy power. The second rule is that this alienness is precisely what makes them dangerous. Not because they choose to harm us, but because harm is an inevitable result of their existence intersecting with ours. The chains parted at his touch, falling away like shed skin. Beyond lay a chamber that defied geometry, its angles wrong in ways that made depth perception impossible. And within that space, something waited. I had expected a creature of obvious menace, claws and teeth and burning eyes. Instead, the demon appeared almost beautiful, tall and graceful, with features that might have been carved from polished obsidian. Its voice, when it spoke, carried notes like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "More offerings for the infinite dance," it said, and somehow those melodious words filled me with terror more complete than any roar or threat could have managed. How delightful, how necessary. "This is a Shivara," Cain explained, "a caster of considerable power. Observe its form, note how it moves. Most importantly, listen to its words and understand that every syllable is calculated to weaken your resolve." The demon laughed, a sound like breaking bells. "Resolve? What need have we of resolve when inevitability surrounds us? You come here seeking power, little mortals. But power is not something that can be taken. It can only be surrendered to." Several of the recruits stepped backward. I found myself among them, some instinct screaming that proximity to this thing was dangerous beyond measure. But Cain stood his ground, and gradually his example steadied us. "Feel its influence," he instructed. "The way it attempts to cloud your thoughts, the subtle suggestions it plants in your mind. This is how demons operate, not through brute force, but through corruption of will." "Corruption," the Shivara mused. Such a crude word for something so beautiful. "We do not corrupt, child of shadow. We reveal. We show what was always there, hidden beneath layers of comforting delusion." Its gaze fell upon Voros, and the paladin's face went pale. "You, defender of the light, do you feel it wavering? The certainty that has carried you through countless battles. Already it begins to fray, to show you the cracks in its foundation." Voros gripped his practiced glaive tighter, knuckles white with strain. "The light is eternal. It cannot be diminished by shadow." "Cannot?" The demon's smile was terrible to behold. "Or will not? Tell me, Paladin, what happens to light when it encounters something that absorbs rather than reflects? What becomes of flame when it meets the void between stars?" I watched Voros struggle with questions that had no comfortable answers. The light had always been presented as absolute, unchanging, eternal. But here was something that challenged that fundamental assumption, not through argument but through simple existence. "Enough," Cain commanded, though I noticed sweat beading on his brow despite the coolness of the chamber. "You have seen what a single demon can accomplish with words alone. Imagine what an army of them might achieve." He sealed the chamber again, but the damage was done. As we climbed back toward the training grounds, none of us spoke. The demon's words echoed in our minds, planting seeds of doubt that would grow in the darkness of our thoughts. That evening, we gathered in what passed for a dining hall. The food was simple fare: bread, meat, water, but it tasted of ash and copper. Around us, veteran demon hunters ate in silence, their attention focused on some inner struggle that never seemed to end. "I felt it," Alestra whispered, breaking the quiet that had held us since our encounter below. "When it spoke, I felt something respond inside me, something that agreed with what it said." Marcus nodded grimly, like it was talking to a part of me I didn't know existed. "That part exists in all of us," said a voice from the neighboring table. We turned to see a blood elf demon hunter, her face bearing scars that spoke of battles beyond counting. The capacity for doubt, for despair, for accepting that perhaps the darkness offers easier answers than the light. She studied us with those burning green orbs. I am Namira Dawnwalker, or was, before I surrendered that name to the path. I have been Illidari for 60 years now, long enough to watch hundreds of recruits face what you face today. How do you resist it? Voros asked, his faith clearly shaken. You don't, Namira replied. Resistance implies opposition, and opposition requires energy you cannot spare. Instead, you acknowledge its truth and choose your response. Yes, the demon speaks to something within you. Yes, part of you finds its words compelling. Accept that reality. Then decide whether you serve that part of yourself or something greater. She gestured toward the veteran demon hunters around us. Everyone here has heard the whispers. Everyone has felt the pull toward easier paths. We remain ourselves not because we are stronger than the darkness, but because we have found purposes stronger than our personal comfort. Over the following days, the training intensified. We learned to channel small amounts of feel energy through our bodies, feeling it burn through our veins like liquid fire. We practiced combat forms that required inhuman flexibility and speed. We studied the anatomies of different demon types, learning where to strike for maximum effect. With each lesson, I felt pieces of my former self falling away. The careful precision that had defined my archery became reckless aggression. The patience that had served me well in scouting transformed into barely contained energy that demanded immediate action. Sleep became elusive, dreams filled with visions of battles I had never fought, and victories achieved through methods I would once have found abhorrent. But perhaps most disturbing was how natural it all began to feel. The burning sensation of feel energy became comfortable, familiar. The inhuman movements required by our combat forms started to seem more correct than the limited motions of mortal flesh. Even the demon's whispers, which we encountered during daily visits to the sealed chambers, began to sound less like temptation and more like simple truth. 1 month into our training, we lost our first recruit, a human priest named Matthias, who had joined us seeking power to heal the wounds left by demonic corruption. During a sparring session, his control slipped for just an instant. The fell energy he had been channeling flared beyond his ability to contain, and his body began the transformation we had all witnessed before. But this time, there were no veteran demon hunters nearby to force him back. We watched in horror as his flesh twisted, as his mind dissolved into pure rage and hunger. When the transformation was complete, nothing of Matthias remained. Only a creature of living shadow and flame that had to be destroyed before it could escape the training grounds. That night, 3 more recruits requested permission to leave. Cain granted it without argument, though I noticed how his gaze lingered on each departing figure, as if memorizing faces he would never see again. The Master does not force this path upon anyone, he told those of us who remained. But he also does not offer second chances to those who prove themselves unworthy of the power they seek. By the end of our 2nd month, our group of 30 had dwindled to 15. Some had died during training accidents. Others had been consumed by the very power they sought to control. A few had simply walked away, unable to bear the weight of what they were becoming. Those of us who remained had changed in ways that went beyond the physical. Our eyes had begun to show flecks of green fire. Our movements carried an inhuman fluidity. When we spoke, harmonics crept into our voices, echoes of the demons whose essence we were slowly learning to channel. But perhaps most significant was the bond that had formed between us. Forged in shared suffering and mutual dependence, it transcended the simple camaraderie of soldiers. We were becoming something new together, something that existed in the space between mortal and demon. The loneliness that such transformation might have brought was held at bay by the knowledge that we were not walking this path alone. Tomorrow, Cain announced on the final day of basic training, you face the trial that will determine your fate. You will bind your first demon. Some of you will emerge from that binding as true Illidari. Others will emerge as something else entirely. And some will not emerge at all. He paused, scanning our faces with those burning eyes. Spend tonight preparing yourselves, not your bodies. They are as ready as they will ever be. Prepare your minds, your souls, your sense of who you are and who you choose to become. Because after tomorrow, there will be no question of choice remaining. You will be what you are, and what you are will be irrevocably changed. I spent that final night in meditation, trying to hold on to the last clear memories of my former self. The ranger who had walked in sunlight, who had drawn strength from natural things, who had believed in simple distinctions between right and wrong. Tomorrow, that person would cease to exist. In their place would stand something new, something necessary perhaps, but alien to everything I had once been. The transformation I had undergone during training was nothing compared to what awaited. Tomorrow I would discover whether I possessed the strength to remain myself while becoming something else entirely. Tomorrow, the real trial would begin. The ritual chamber lay deep beneath the Black Temple, carved from living rock that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent heartbeat. I had imagined this moment countless times during the months of training, but reality exceeded even my most fevered nightmares. The air itself felt thick with accumulated anguish, as if the stone walls had absorbed the screams of thousands who had undergone this transformation before us. 15 of us remained. 15 souls about to surrender everything they had been for the promise of what they might become. We stood in a circle around a pit that descended into darkness so complete it seemed to devour light itself. From those depths came sounds that spoke of barely contained chaos. The rustle of leathery wings, the scrape of claws on stone, the whispered promises of creatures that had never known mortal flesh. Today, Cain's Sunfury intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in our bones. You cease to be what you were. Today, you become vessels for powers that mortal minds were never meant to contain. Some of you will emerge from this trial as Illidari. Others will emerge as something else entirely. And some... He let the words hang in the air like an executioner's blade. We all knew the statistics. More than half of those who attempted the binding died in the process. Of those who survived, perhaps 1 in 3 retained enough of their original identity to be considered successful. The rest became something between demon and mortal, useful as shock troops, but too unstable for anything requiring subtlety or long-term planning. Step forward when your name is called, Altruis commanded from his position beside the pit. Face your destiny with whatever courage remains to you. They began with Marcus, the human warrior whose steady presence had anchored our group through the darkest moments of training. He approached the pit's edge with the same methodical precision that had defined his martial practice. But I could see the tremor in his hands, the tightness around his eyes that spoke of barely controlled terror. Marcus Thornfield, Altruis called. What demon do you choose to bind? Ash Tongue, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the fear. It was a dangerous choice. Ash Tongue demons possessed considerable power, but were known for their cunning and their tendency to corrupt their hosts through subtle manipulation rather than brute force. From the pit's depths, something stirred. The darkness seemed to coalesce, taking form as it rose toward the chamber's floor. The Ashtong that emerged was beautiful in the way that poisonous flowers are beautiful, elegant, mesmerizing, and utterly deadly. Its voice, when it spoke, carried notes like silver bells dipped in honey. Such a brave little warrior, it purred, circling Marcus with predatory grace. Such determination, such delicious certainty. I wonder how long it will last once you truly understand what you have invited into yourself. The Binding ritual began with words in a language that predated mortal civilization. Cain's voice wove patterns in the air, creating invisible chains that would hold the demon just long enough for the fusion to take place. But the ash tongue was not passive. Even as the binding took hold, it whispered to Marcus, its words too quiet for the rest of us to hear, but their effect immediately apparent. Marcus's face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chamber's coolness. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and I could see his pupils dilating as whatever the demon showed him took hold of his mind. "Focus," Altruis commanded. "Remember who you are. Remember why you chose this path." But it was already too late. The moment Marcus opened himself to accept the demon's essence, his control shattered. The transformation that followed was violent beyond description. His body contorted as bones lengthened and muscles reshaped themselves. His skin took on a greenish hue, and when he opened his mouth to scream, fangs gleamed in the chamber's dim light. The creature that had been Marcus lasted perhaps 30 seconds before the veteran demon hunters were forced to destroy it. What remained could barely be called a corpse, more a twisted amalgamation of flesh and shadow that continued to writhe even in death. "The binding failed," Cain announced with clinical detachment. The candidate's will proved insufficient to contain the demon's influence. "Who is next?" One by one, my companions approached the pit. One by one, they faced the choice that would define the rest of their existence. Some succeeded in maintaining enough of themselves to emerge as functional demon hunters. Alestra bound herself to a succubus, emerging with her nobility intact, but her beauty transformed into something sharp and predatory. Voros chose a Wrathguard and managed to retain his paladin's discipline, though his connection to the light was forever changed. But for every success, there was failure, painful, violent, absolute. Bodies destroyed by power they could not contain. Minds shattered by alien thoughts they could not process. Souls consumed by hungers they could not resist. When my name was called, 8 of the original 15 remained. 7 had died in the binding process, their remains cleared away with mechanical efficiency. The survivors stood around the chamber's perimeter, their eyes burning with new fire, their forms subtly changed by the demons they now carried within. I approached the pit on legs that felt disconnected from my body. The months of training had prepared me physically and mentally for this moment, but no amount of preparation could truly ready a soul for willingly inviting damnation. The darkness below seemed to reach toward me with invisible tendrils, promising power beyond imagination and corruption beyond redemption. "What demon do you choose?" Altruis asked, though his burning gaze suggested he already knew my own answer. "Nathrezim," I replied, the word tasting like ashes in my mouth. A collective intake of breath from the watching veterans. Dreadlords were among the most dangerous demons to bind. Powerful, intelligent, and utterly devoted to corruption for its own sake. They did not simply seek to destroy their hosts, but to remake them into perfect instruments of chaos. Few who attempted to bind a Nathrezim emerged with their sanity intact. "Bold," Cain observed, "or foolish. We shall see which." The darkness at the pit's bottom stirred differently than it had for the previous bindings. Where the other demons had risen with purpose, this one seemed to flow upward like liquid shadow given form. When it finally took shape at the chamber's edge, I found myself staring into eyes that held the accumulated malice of 10,000 years. "Fascinating," the Nathrezim said in a voice like silk wrapped around a blade. "Another mortal seeking to dance with powers beyond comprehension. Tell me, little elf, what makes you believe you can succeed where so many have failed?" I had prepared for this question during the long nights of meditation. because I have no illusions about what I am becoming. I do not seek to control you or to remain unchanged. I seek partnership in a cause greater than either of us alone. The Dreadlord's laugh was like breaking glass. Partnership! How refreshingly honest. And yet honesty will not save you when my thoughts become your thoughts, when my desires burn in your veins, when my memories of endless worlds dying in beautiful agony become more real to you than your own past. The binding words began, and I felt the invisible chains taking hold of both the demon and myself. This was the crucial moment, the instant when two incompatible forms of existence would be forced into a single vessel. The pain was immediate and absolute, as if every nerve in my body had been set ablaze simultaneously. But worse than the physical agony was the mental intrusion. The Nathrezim's consciousness crashed into mine like a tide of liquid darkness, bringing with it memories that spanned millennia. I saw worlds burning under Legion assault, felt the satisfaction of corruption spreading like plague through innocent populations, experienced the exquisite pleasure of watching hope die in the eyes of the defeated. These were not my memories, but they became mine nonetheless. The Dreadlord's emotions flooded through me. Its joy at destruction, its contempt for weakness, its absolute certainty that order was merely chaos waiting to be revealed. I felt my own identity fragmenting under the assault, pieces of who I had been dissolving into the alien vastness of the demon's psyche. Yes, the Nathrezim whispered inside my mind. Feel yourself dissolving. Understand that resistance is futile. You sought power, and power demands sacrifice. Surrender what you were, and embrace what you shall become. For a moment, I teetered on the edge of complete dissolution. It would have been so easy to let go, to allow the demon's will to subsume my own. The pain would end, the struggle would cease, and I would exist as something pure and terrible and uncomplicated by mortal concerns. But in that moment of ultimate darkness, I found something unexpected. Not resistance, but acceptance. I stopped fighting the demon's memories and instead examined them with the analytical mind that had served me well as a ranger. Yes, these visions were horrifying. Yes, they showed me truths about existence that no mortal should know. But they were also information. Intelligence about an enemy that had threatened everything I held dear. Clever, the Dreadlord acknowledged, its voice now coming from within my own thoughts rather than from outside. You do not resist the darkness, but seek to understand it. Perhaps you will survive this after all. The physical transformation that followed was less violent than what I had witnessed in the failed bindings. My bones elongated gradually rather than snapping into new configurations. My muscles reshaped themselves with purpose rather than random mutation. Most significantly, my eyes began to burn, not with pain, but with new kinds of sight that revealed realities I had never imagined. But with this new vision came the cruelest part of the trial. To see as a demon hunter sees, one must sacrifice the eyes that perceive only surface reality. The ritual dagger felt warm in my hands, its fell-forged blade humming with anticipation. Around me, the other survivors watched with expressions I could not read. Sympathy, perhaps, or simple relief that they were not the ones facing this moment. The choice must be yours alone, Altruis said softly. No one can take this step for you. I raised the blade to my right eye, feeling the demon's excitement at this ultimate act of commitment. The steel was sharp enough that the initial cut brought more shock than pain. Warm blood ran down my cheek as I carved away the organ that had shown me sunlight and starfire, forest paths, and beloved faces. The left eye followed, my hands moving with steady precision despite the agony that threatened to overwhelm my senses. When it was done, when both eyes lay destroyed at my feet, darkness claimed me completely. But only for a moment. New sight flowered behind my ruined sockets. Not the simple perception of reflected light that had served me before, but something far more profound. I could see the magical energies that flowed through all things, the connections between souls that bound the living together, the hidden corruptions that lurked beneath surface appearances. The world revealed itself as it truly was, not the comfortable illusion mortals perceived, but a place where light and shadow danced in eternal conflict. "Welcome to reality," the Dreadlord said inside my mind, and for the first time, its voice carried something approaching warmth. "Now you begin to understand what we fight for. Not mere destruction, but truth. The truth that chaos is the natural state of existence, and that order is simply a temporary arrangement waiting to be corrected." I felt myself nodding, though whether in agreement or simply acknowledgement I could not say. The demon's perspective was seductive in its clarity. From this new vantage point, mortal concerns seemed petty and fleeting. The civilizations that rose and fell like waves on a beach, the individual lives that burned briefly before guttering out. What meaning could such ephemeral things have in the face of cosmic reality? But beneath the demon's certainty, I sensed something else, a kind of desperate hunger that spoke not of confidence but of need. The Nathrezim fed on corruption and chaos, not because these things were inherently superior, but because they were necessary for its existence. It was not a philosopher offering truth, but a parasite seeking sustenance. That realization became my anchor. Yes, I now carried a demon within my soul. Yes, its thoughts had become my thoughts, its memories my memories. But I also retained enough of myself to recognize what it was and why it sought to remake me in its image. The binding was not a surrender, but a balance, a constant negotiation between two forms of consciousness that could coexist without either completely dominating the other. "Interesting," the Dreadlord observed. "You maintain your sense of self while accepting mine. Few manage such equilibrium. Perhaps you will prove a worthy host after all." When I opened my new eyes, the first thing I saw was approval on the faces of the veteran demon hunters. Not warmth, that emotion seemed foreign to their transformed nature, but professional satisfaction at a task completed successfully. I had passed the trial. I had become something new while remaining recognizably myself. "Rise, Illidari," Cain commanded, and I felt the weight of that title settling over me like armor. "You have sacrificed everything for power. Now learn to wield that power wisely." The chamber had changed while I underwent my transformation, or perhaps my new sight simply revealed aspects that mortal eyes could not perceive. The walls pulsed with veins of feel energy, and shadowy figures moved just beyond the edge of vision. Other demons, other possibilities, other paths that might have been chosen. But it was the figure that emerged from the deepest shadows that commanded my attention. Tall beyond mortal proportion, wings spread wide, horns crowned with fire that cast no light. When Illidan Stormrage spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions I had not known existed. "So," he said, studying us with those burning orbs that had once been eyes, "8 more join our ranks. 8 more souls given freely to a cause that offers no reward save the knowledge that you have chosen correctly." He moved among us, examining each transformation with the critical eye of a master craftsman. When he reached me, I felt the full weight of his attention, and beneath it, the vast intelligence that had walked this path longer than any other. "Nathrezim," he observed, "a dangerous choice. The Dreadlords corrupt through subtlety rather than force. Their influence grows slowly but inevitably. Tell me, do you feel your thoughts changing, your priorities shifting, your understanding of right and wrong becoming more flexible?" I considered the question carefully. Yes, the demon's perspective had become part of my own. Yes, I found myself viewing mortal concerns with a detachment that would once have horrified me, but the core of who I was remained intact, perhaps even strengthened by the struggle to maintain it. "I feel change," I replied, "but change guided by choice rather than compulsion. The demon shows me new truths, but I remain free to decide how to act upon them." Illidan nodded slowly. "A wise answer. Wisdom you will need in the trials ahead, for your true test begins now. Not the binding itself, but learning to live with what you have become." He addressed all of us then, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. "You have sacrificed everything to gain power sufficient to fight the Legion. But power without purpose is merely destruction. You must find meaning in your transformation, reason for the prices you have paid. The road ahead will be long and dark. You will face enemies who view you as abominations, allies who fear what you have become, and battles that will test not just your abilities, but your resolve to remain true to your chosen purpose. Some of you will falter. Some will be consumed by the very power you sought to control. But those who endure will stand as guardians against a darkness that threatens all existence." As his words echoed in the chamber, I felt the truth of them settling into my bones. The transformation was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. I had become something new, something necessary, something that existed in the space between mortal and demon. Whether that transformation would prove to be salvation or damnation remained to be seen. But for now, in this moment between what I had been and what I would become, I was content to exist as a weapon pointed at the heart of darkness itself. The Legion would learn to fear our approach, and perhaps, if we were fortunate, the world would remember that monsters sometimes chose to serve the light. The ritual was complete. The Illidari had been born, and somewhere in the depths of my transformed soul, I felt the demon that was now part of me settle into what might, in time, become something approaching peace. The fell crystal grew around me like crystallized time, each facet reflecting not light but memory, trapping me in amber made of concentrated despair. 10,000 years. I learned to measure eternity not in days or seasons, for such mortal concepts held no meaning in the vault of the Wardens, but in the slow erosion of hope, the gradual transformation of rage into resignation, and finally into something approaching wisdom. They came for us at dawn, though dawn in the Black Temple was merely a lessening of darkness rather than the arrival of light. Maiev Shadowsong herself led the assault, her watchers moving through our halls like whispers of vengeance given form. We fought, of course. The power we had sacrificed everything to obtain was not yielded easily, but numbers told, and preparation, and perhaps most damning of all, the simple fact that the world had turned against us. I remember the moment when Illidan fell. Not the physical fall. That came later, in chambers far from where we lesser Illidari made our desperate stand, but the moment when his presence, that constant background hum of purpose and power that had defined our existence, simply vanished. One instant we were warriors serving a cause greater than ourselves. The next, we were criminals without a master, demons without direction. The battle ended not with our defeat, but with our capture. Maiev's forces were prepared for demon hunters in ways that ordinary soldiers could never have been. They carried weapons blessed against fell corruption, wore armor inscribed with bindings that made our supernatural speed and strength irrelevant. Most significantly, they brought shackles of crystallized starlight, chains that bound not our bodies, but our souls themselves. "You will answer for your crimes," Maiev declared as we knelt in defeat among the ruins of what had been our sanctuary. Her voice carried a weight of personal satisfaction that spoke of long-anticipated vengeance. "Every innocent life lost to your master's ambitions, every world threatened by the powers you chose to embrace, all will be accounted for." I wanted to protest, to explain that our choices had been made in service of a greater good, that the sacrifices we had embraced were necessary to combat an evil beyond imagination. But the words died in my throat as I looked around at the devastation our final battle had wrought. How many of Maev's watchers had fallen to our blades? How many had died believing they served justice while we believed we served necessity? The truth, I began to understand, might be more complex than either side was willing to acknowledge. The journey to the vault of the Wardens passed in a haze of pain and shame. The starlight shackles burned against demonic essence, creating a constant agony that made clear thought nearly impossible. But worse than the physical torment was the psychological weight of our fall. We had been champions, warriors of light operating in shadow for the greater good. Now we were prisoners, criminals whose very existence was evidence of choices that the world considered fundamentally wrong. The vault itself defied description in terms that mortal minds could easily process. Carved from a mountain that existed partially in our reality and partially in the space between dimensions, it served as prison for threats too dangerous to execute but too powerful to contain through conventional means. The architecture followed rules that had nothing to do with mortal needs or comfort. Corridors that led nowhere, stairs that climbed in directions that had no names, chambers that were somehow larger inside than the spaces that contained them. Our cells were masterworks of arcane engineering, each one tailored specifically to the nature of its intended occupant. For demon hunters, this meant isolation not just from the physical world, but from the fill energies that had become as necessary to our existence as air or water. The crystals that formed our prisons absorbed and redirected the chaotic forces we channeled, creating a feedback loop that turned our own power against us. But perhaps cruelest of all was the fact that we were not truly cut off from the outside world. Through the crystal walls, we could perceive glimpses of the reality beyond our confinement. Fragments of images, echoes of sounds, whispers of events that shaped the world while we remained helpless to influence them. It was enough to prevent the total madness that might have been a mercy, but not enough to provide any real connection to the life we had lost. I learned to mark the passage of time by these fragments, the rise and fall of mortal kingdoms, the changing patterns of magical energy that spoke of great workings accomplished or undone, the subtle shifts in the air itself as the world moved through seasons I could no longer feel directly. Years became decades, decades became centuries, and still the crystal held us in its inexorable embrace. The demon within me, the Nathradzim whose essence had become part of my own, proved to be an unexpected companion during those long years of isolation. Where once its whispers had sought to corrupt and control, now they offered a kind of sardonic commentary on our shared fate. Ironic, is it not? It mused during one of the countless nights when sleep would not come. We who sought to save the world now exist as evidence of its moral certainty. They sleep peacefully knowing that justice has been served, while we contemplate the prices of good intentions. I had learned to appreciate the demon's perspective during our imprisonment, not because I agreed with its fundamental nature, but because it offered viewpoints that my own limited understanding could never have reached. Through its ancient eyes, I began to see patterns in history that mortal lives were too brief to perceive. The endless cycle of good intentions leading to terrible consequences, of necessary evils justified by noble purposes, of heroes becoming villains simply by outliving the conflicts that defined them. Do you believe we were wrong? I asked during one of our internal conversations, perhaps in the third millennium of our confinement. Wrong implies moral judgment, the Dreadlord replied. We made choices based on incomplete information and limited options. The results were suboptimal, but given the same circumstances and knowledge, would you choose differently? The question haunted me for decades afterward. Would I have refused Illidan's call if I had known it would lead to this crystalline eternity? Would I have turned away from the power to fight the Legion if I could have foreseen the price of obtaining it? The honest answer was that I did not know, and that uncertainty was perhaps the most damning verdict of all. Other Illidari shared my confinement, though communication between us was limited to moments when the prison's arcane barriers fluctuated enough to allow brief contact. I could sense Alestra somewhere in the crystalline maze, her noble spirit unbroken despite the weight of ages. Voros remained strong in his faith, though that faith had evolved into something that bore little resemblance to the simple certainty he had once embraced. Others had fared less well. The demon hunter who had bound himself to an Eridar grew increasingly unstable as the centuries passed, his conversations with his inner demon becoming indistinguishable from madness. We were not the only prisoners in the vault, of course. Through the crystal walls, I sometimes caught glimpses of other cells, other inmates whose crimes had earned them this timeless punishment. Ancient sorcerers who had delved too deeply into forbidden knowledge, cultists who had served powers better left unnamed, warriors who had embraced dark gifts in service of causes both noble and corrupt. We were all part of the same vast collection of souls who had chosen necessity over comfort, purpose over safety, and found themselves condemned by a world that could not distinguish between evil actions and evil intentions. As the millennia passed, I began to understand something fundamental about the nature of justice. It was not, as I had once believed, about reward and punishment, about ensuring that good was rewarded and evil was punished. It was about stability, about maintaining a status quo that allowed civilization to function. Those who threatened that stability, regardless of their motivations, would always be cast in the role of villains. We had threatened stability, not through conquest or destruction, but by demonstrating that sometimes the choices required to preserve what people loved demanded embracing what they feared. The world had rejected that demonstration by rejecting us, preferring to face future threats with clean hands rather than accept that clean hands might not be sufficient. The irony was that our imprisonment proved our critics right, at least temporarily. The world continued to turn without us. Mortals found other ways to deal with supernatural threats. Heroes arose who managed to save the day without sacrificing their souls or embracing demonic power. Our transformation appeared, from their perspective, to have been unnecessary after all. But I knew, with the certainty that came from carrying demonic memories spanning eons, that this peace was temporary. The Legion would return, as it always did. New threats would emerge that conventional heroes could not handle, and when that time came, the world would face a choice: accept the necessity of those who had embraced darkness for the greater good, or watch everything burn in the name of moral purity. The question was whether any of us would still exist to offer our services when that moment arrived. Hope became a luxury I could not afford. Each passing century made it less likely that we would ever see freedom again. The world was moving on without us, developing new solutions to old problems, new heroes to face eternal threats. We were becoming relics of a time when desperate measures had seemed justified, museum pieces preserved as warnings against the dangers of good intentions pushed to extremes. But despair, too, was a luxury beyond my reach. The demon within me would not permit such simple surrender. Nathrazim did not give up, did not accept defeat, did not acknowledge the possibility of permanent loss. Where hope failed, stubborn persistence remained. Where faith wavered, pragmatic determination endured. We are patient, the Dreadlord reminded me when darker thoughts threatened to overwhelm my reason. We have always been patient. Mortals measure time in lifetimes. We measure it in the rise and fall of civilizations. What seems like eternity to you is merely a momentary setback to me. And gradually, I began to internalize that patience. Not the desperate hope of imminent rescue, but the deeper understanding that all things change, all situations evolve, all certainties eventually crumble. The world that had condemned us would not remain unchanged forever. New challenges would arise that could not be met through conventional means. New heroes would discover that good intentions alone were insufficient against certain forms of evil. When that time came, we would be ready. Changed by our confinement, perhaps. Shaped by millennia of reflection and internal struggle. But ready nonetheless to resume our vigil against the darkness that mortals could not face alone. The thought did not bring comfort exactly, but it brought something more valuable. Purpose. Even trapped in crystal, even forgotten by the world, even condemned by those we had sought to protect, we remained what we had always been. Guardians standing watch against threats too terrible for others to face. The vigil continued, even in chains. The sacrifice endured, even in isolation. And somewhere in the crystalline depths of the vault of the Wardens, 8 demon hunters waited with the infinite patience of the damned for a world that would eventually, inevitably, have need of monsters who chose to serve the light. Time meant nothing here. But eventually, all prisons fail. All certainties crumble. All judgments are overturned by the simple weight of changing circumstances. We would endure until that day came, because endurance was all we had left. And endurance, it turned out, was enough. The first sound in 10,000 years that was not the whisper of my own thoughts or the distant murmur of the Dreadlord's memories came as thunder. Not the rolling crash of natural storms, but something sharper, more immediate. The sound of reality itself being torn apart by forces that should never have been unleashed upon the mortal world. I had learned to read the subtle vibrations that passed through the crystalline matrix of my prison. Earthquakes registered as gentle tremors. The deaths of archdruids created barely perceptible shifts in natural energies. Even the shattering of the world itself, when Deathwing emerged from Deepholm, had manifested as nothing more than a temporary fluctuation in the vault's magical containment systems. This was different. This was violence on a scale that made the crystal walls themselves scream in harmonics that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated directly in whatever remained of my soul. Through the fractured reflections of my prison, I caught glimpses of green fire blooming across distant mountainsides, of fell energies so concentrated they turned the very air toxic. The Legion had returned. At last, the Nathrazim whispered inside my mind, its voice carrying notes of satisfaction that bordered on ecstasy. Did I not tell you? Did I not promise that patience would be rewarded? They come as they always come, as they always must. And now the mortals will learn what it costs to reject necessary weapons. But even as the Dreadlord gloated, I felt something else stirring in the depths of our shared consciousness. Not satisfaction, but sorrow. The return of the Legion meant that millions would die. Cities would burn. Children would scream in the night as reality itself was corrupted beyond recognition. All because the world had chosen moral purity over pragmatic necessity. The sounds of battle grew closer. Through the crystal walls, I could see flashes of movement. Wardens racing through corridors that defied geometry, their forms blurred by protective enchantments and desperate haste. The vault's defenses, designed to keep prisoners in and intruders out, were being overwhelmed by forces that cared nothing for architectural impossibilities. Then came the sound I had hoped never to hear again. Maiev Shadowsong's voice, raised not in triumph or condemnation, but in something approaching desperation. "Open the vaults! All of them!" The words echoed through dimensions that had no names, carrying implications that struck me like physical blows. To open our prisons would require Maiev to acknowledge that the sentences she had spent millennia enforcing were no longer just, that the criminals she had guarded with such dedication might, in fact, be exactly what the world needed to survive. Footsteps approached my cell, not the measured pace of routine inspection, but the hurried stride of someone acting against every instinct they possessed. When Maiev appeared before my crystalline prison, I saw that, 10,000 years had changed her as surely as they had changed me. The righteous certainty that had once defined her had been tempered by experience, shaped by the weight of choices that had seemed clear in their time but grown murky with age. "Demon Hunter," she said, her voice carrying none of the contempt that had marked our last encounter. "The Legion returns. Their force is beyond anything we have faced before. The world has need of monsters again." She raised her hand, and I felt the bindings that had held me for so long beginning to weaken. Not release, not yet, but the promise of it, contingent on choices I had not yet made. "I offer you freedom," she continued, "not forgiveness, not absolution, but freedom in exchange for your service against the darkness that threatens to consume everything we have ever loved." I could have demanded an apology, could have pointed out the irony of my captor seeking aid from those she had condemned, could have negotiated for better terms, for acknowledgement of the injustices we had suffered, for recognition that our imprisonment had been motivated more by fear than by justice. Instead, I simply nodded. The crystal dissolved around me like morning mist, and for the first time in 10 millennia, I drew breath that had not been filtered through arcane barriers. The air tasted of smoke and fell corruption, of terror and approaching doom. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. Around me, other prisons opened. Alestra emerged from her confinement with the same noble bearing that had defined her before our transformation, though I could see new depths in her burning eyes that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Voros stepped forth with his faith intact, but evolved, tempered by centuries of contemplation, into something more flexible than the rigid certainty he had once embraced. Not all of the Illidari had survived their imprisonment. Some had been consumed by the very demons they carried, their consciousness finally overwhelmed by alien thoughts and desires. Others had simply faded, worn away by the slow erosion of time until nothing remained but empty shells animated by fell energy and instinct. But 8 of us emerged whole enough to fight. 8 survivors of a transformation that had claimed dozens. Prisoners of a justice that had lasted longer than most civilizations. Guardians returning to a world that had moved on without us. The journey to the surface revealed the scope of the catastrophe we faced. The Vault of the Wardens, that impregnable fortress carved from stone and starlight, lay in ruins. Demon forces swarmed through its corridors like antibodies attacking an infection, their presence turning the very architecture against itself. Where they passed, reality became fluid, unreliable, shaped more by chaotic will than by physical law. But it was when we reached the outer world that the true magnitude of the Legion's return became clear. The sky burned with green, fire that fell like rain, each drop carrying enough corruption to poison a village well. In the distance, massive portals vomited forth armies that beggared imagination. Not just the lesser demons we had fought in Outland, but creatures of legend, beings of such power that their mere presence warped the fabric of existence around them. The mortal defenders fought bravely. Soldiers of the Alliance and Horde stood shoulder to shoulder against an enemy that rendered their old conflicts irrelevant. Mages wove barriers of pure will against chaos given form. Priests called upon the light to hold back darkness so complete it seemed to devour hope itself. But they were losing. Badly. The tactics that had served against mortal enemies, The strategies that had proven effective against earthly threats were woefully inadequate against forces that existed partially outside reality itself. I watched entire battalions reduced to ash by demons who fought not just with claw and fang, but with weapons forged from crystallized despair. "Now, do you understand?" Maiev asked as we stood upon a ridge overlooking a battlefield that stretched to the horizon. "Now, do you see why I chose to release you despite every principle I have held sacred?" I nodded, but my attention was focused elsewhere. In the distance, something was happening to one of the larger demons, a fell lord whose presence had been turning the tide against the mortal defenders. Its form was flickering, wavering, as if something was attacking it from within. Then I saw him. Or rather, I saw the spectral echo of him, visible only to eyes that had learned to perceive realities beyond the merely physical. Illidan's storm rage, or what remained of him, his spiritual essence somehow persisting despite the death of his physical form. He was fighting, still fighting, using powers I could not begin to comprehend to strike at the Legion from dimensions they could not defend against. "Master," I whispered, the word carrying more weight than any prayer I had ever uttered. The spectral figure turned, and for a moment, our eyes met across impossible distances. In that gaze, I saw recognition, approval, and something that might have been relief. He gestured towards something beyond my immediate perception, and suddenly I understood. This was not random destruction. The Legion had come for something specific, something they needed to complete their conquest, not just of this world but of all worlds. The Sargerite Keystone, the artifact that could unlock the pathways between dimensions, that could turn the entire cosmos into a playground for demonic corruption. It had been hidden away after our defeat, secured by protections that even the Legion could not easily breach. But those protections were failing under the assault of forces that had learned from their previous defeats. "We have to stop them," Alestra said, her voice carrying the same determination that had driven her to answer Illidan's call all those years ago. "Whatever they're after, we cannot allow them to succeed." But even as we prepared to enter the battle, I could see the fear in the eyes of the mortal defenders. Not fear of the demons, that was clean terror, honest and uncomplicated. Fear of us. We were abominations to them, creatures that violated the natural order in ways that made their skin crawl and their minds recoil. Allied with necessity we might be, but trusted we would never be. The first engagement proved their point. When we joined the battle, our effectiveness was immediate and devastating. Demons that had shrugged off conventional weapons fell before our glaives like wheat before the scythe. Spells that had proven useless against a fell corruption found purchase when channeled through our transformed essence. In minutes, we accomplished what entire companies of mortal soldiers had failed to achieve in hours. But the cost of that effectiveness was written on every face that watched us. We moved too fast, struck too precisely, killed too efficiently. When we channeled fell energy through our bodies, the air around us became toxic to normal life. When we called upon the demons bound to our souls, reality itself seemed to flinch away from our presence. We were weapons, necessary weapons, perhaps even righteous weapons, but weapons nonetheless. Tools to be used when no other options remained, then put away until the next crisis demanded their deployment. The realization should have been bitter, but instead I found it oddly comforting. Purpose, even purpose tinged with revulsion, was better than the purposelessness of imprisonment. If the world needed us to be monsters, then monsters we would be. If salvation required damnation, then damned we would remain. The campaign that followed was unlike anything from our time serving under Illidan. Then, we had been part of a grand strategy, pieces in a cosmic game whose rules we only dimly understood. Now, we were improvisations, desperate measures deployed against threats that conventional forces could not handle. We fought through legions' strongholds where reality had been so corrupted that up and down were matters of opinion. We hunted demon lords whose very existence poisoned the ground they walked upon. We defended civilians who fled from us almost as frantically as they fled from our enemies. And through it all, Illidan's spectral presence guided us. Not directly. Whatever had preserved his consciousness after death did not permit easy communication, but through signs and portents that only eyes trained in FL corruption could perceive. A pattern in the way demons fell that pointed toward hidden passages. Fluctuations in fell energy that revealed the locations of critical artifacts. The Sargerite keystone, when we finally located it, was more than just an artifact. It was a nexus point, a place where the barriers between dimensions had worn thin enough that multiple realities overlapped. Claiming it required not just defeating its demonic guardians, but navigating the paradoxes of spaces that existed in several places simultaneously. But we succeeded. 8 demon hunters against a fortress designed to withstand armies, and we succeeded. The keystone fell into our hands just as the Legion's ultimate gambit revealed itself. Gul'dan, the Orc warlock whose corruption had begun the cycle of violence that led to this moment. But not the Gul'dan we had known. This was something else, something that had learned from the failures of its predecessor. It sought not just to open a portal for the Legion, but to claim a vessel powerful enough to contain Sargeras himself, Illidan's body. Preserved despite death, corrupted despite preservation, it waited in chambers deep beneath the broken isles where the Legion's master plan would reach its culmination. If Sargeras gained physical form on Azeroth, if the Dark Titan walked among mortals with all his power intact, then no force in existence could stand against him. But preservation worked both ways. If the body could be reclaimed, if the soul that had once inhabited it could be restored, the resurrection was not magic in any sense that mortals understood. It was necessity given form, will imposed upon reality through forces that recognized no boundaries between life and death. Illidan's return was not healing, but reconstruction, not revival, but redemption. When he stood before us again, wings spread against the dying light, I felt something I had thought lost forever. Hope. Not the desperate hope of the prisoner dreaming of freedom, but the solid, practical hope of a soldier who sees reinforcements arriving at the crucial moment. "My Illidari," he said, and in those words was acknowledgement, approval, and something that might have been pride. "You have endured, you have served, you have proven that some sacrifices transcend time itself." What followed was war on a scale that dwarfed our previous campaigns. Not just battle against the Legion's forces on Azeroth, but pursuit of them to their very strongholds, to worlds where chaos reigned supreme and reality bent to demonic will. We fought through the broken isles, through the twisted spires of Antares, finally to Argus itself, the Legion's seat of power, the world where Sargeras had first begun his crusade against existence. The final battle was not what I had expected, not a glorious confrontation between good and evil, but something quieter, more personal. Illidan faced not Sargeras himself, but the necessity of ensuring that the Dark Titan could never again threaten the cosmos. And that necessity demanded the ultimate sacrifice. Not death, which would be temporary, but eternal vigilance, eternal imprisonment, eternal separation from everything he had ever loved. I watched him make that choice with the same measured determination that had defined all his decisions. No hesitation, no regret, no plea for understanding or sympathy. Simply the recognition that some duties could not be shared, some burdens could not be delegated. When the portal closed behind them, Illidan and his eternal prisoner, I felt something shift in the fabric of reality itself. The threat was ended. The Legion was broken. The cosmos was safe, at least for now. But the cost was everything we had been, everything we had hoped to become. We returned to a world that welcomed us as heroes and feared us as abominations. The salvation we had helped to achieve came with conditions, restrictions, reminders that our nature remained fundamentally incompatible with normal life. We were honored, respected, and kept at arm's length. It was enough. It had to be enough. Because in the end, we had learned the truth that our long imprisonment had tried to teach us. Meaning did not come from recognition or reward, but from the simple knowledge that we had chosen correctly, that our sacrifices had served purposes greater than our own comfort. The vigil continued. It would always continue. Somewhere beyond the edges of reality, Illidan stood guard against threats too terrible to name. And here, in the world he had died to protect, we maintained our own watch, ready to face whatever darkness might yet emerge. We were the Illidari. We had sacrificed everything, and we had discovered that everything had been exactly enough. The fell blood has dried now, leaving only a stain on cold stone. I sit in chambers once used to imprison us, now transformed into a sanctuary for those who understand the price of vigilance. The Legion is defeated, Sargeras contained, but we remain, changed, scarred, forever marked by what we chose to become. New threats will rise, they always do, and when they come, there will be those willing to sacrifice everything to stand against the darkness. We taught them that such sacrifices have meaning, that even the damned can serve the light. Illidan was right in the end. We were prepared, not for glory, not for redemption, but for the simple truth that some battles can only be fought by those who have already lost everything. The young still come to us sometimes, seeking our path. I tell them what I wish someone had told me. This road leads through hell, and not all who walk it return. But for those who do, who endure the trials and emerge whole enough to fight, the world is grateful, even if it can never understand. We are the Illidari. We have sacrificed everything, and we would do it again, because in the space between light and shadow, between salvation and damnation, we found something worth preserving. Not ourselves. We surrendered that claim long ago. But the simple truth that monsters, when they choose their purpose wisely, can serve as guardians for all that remains beautiful in this broken world.